I am Martin Indyk, the Executive Vice President of the Brookings Institution. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to this program on moving to access and the initiative we're undertaking here at Brookings in that regard. I'm particularly grateful to Secretary Mendez, Secretary of Transportation from Buenos Aires, and Secretary Pollock, Secretary of Transportation and CEO of the Department of Transportation from Massachusetts, for joining us this morning. Later on in the day, we'll have the pleasure of hosting Secretary Fox, the Secretary of Transportation of the United States. The Moving to Access initiative aims to inform and promote a more socially focused, access-first approach to urban transportation policy, planning, investment, and services. I want to talk first a little bit about how we at Brookings are executing this project, because it is a flagship effort in terms of the approach that we are trying to promote in Brookings' second century, which officially begins this month, in which we are seeking to promote collaboration across our different research programs. Few of you will be aware that we have 106 full-time scholars at Brookings that cover every imaginable issue of policy, starting, of course, with urban policy, but going all the way across to global economic development and foreign policy. The research programs have tended to develop as stovepipes, as all large organizations tend to do. And so as part of our second century initiatives, we are seeking to promote collaboration across our research programs. And I'm delighted that the Metropolitan Policy Program, led by Amy Liu, is coming together with our Global Economy and Development Program, led by Kamal Dervis, to promote this cross-program initiative on moving to access. This is, from our perspective, the way to promote the best of Brookings, combining unique scholarly specialties in both urban and global development issues. And this is, I think, unique a collaboration which I hope you will see in action today and the benefits it can bring. This initiative also brings together two of our common challenges: urbanization and growth and opportunity. We identified 5 big bets that our scholars would focus on over the next coming years, and urbanization and growth and opportunity were 2 of them. And this kind of multidisciplinary work is important to developing and advancing understanding about policy issues in our hyper-connected world. As you'll hear throughout this morning's events, cities and metropolitan areas all across the world understand the challenges that come from trying to get their residents to where they need to go on a daily basis. This can't just be a playground for the rich. We need our built environment to work for all people, regardless of income, race, or local geography. So you'll be hearing from a panel of experts, many of whom are actively working in different parts of the world, but facing these same challenges every day. To introduce the Moving to Access initiative, I want to introduce you to Adi Tome. Adi Tome is one of our Rising Star scholars, a fellow in our Metropolitan Policy Program, where he serves as the co-director of this initiative. So Adi, thank you for your work in this regard, and please come and explain to us what it's all about.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Martin, for that really kind introduction. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time to make it down here today to the Brookings Institution. It's a really, really busy week here in Washington. I think anyone who loads a newspaper from any geography is hearing about what's happening further down Massachusetts Avenue, or you could say Pennsylvania Avenue too, for hearings on Capitol Hill. But for many of us in the transportation industry, it's actually a busy week that we knew was coming anyways, because it's the Transportation Research Board meetings. And for those of you who may not be in the know, this is why whenever you've traveled around Mount Vernon Square for the past week or so, you see a ridiculously long line of taxis, and it's busier than normal when you try to travel through that little underpass on L Street. In a town that is really built around hosting conventions, this is actually pretty much one of the biggest, if not the biggest, we have all year. And what it is actually the single biggest global convention, if you want to use that word, of transportation professionals from a huge range of disciplines. And that, by bringing those people together, what you see is a huge array of different topics that people are covering. In one room, you can find chemical engineers talking about pavement quality and how to make sure that porousness, well, I'm not going to keep talking about it because I'm not a chemical engineer and I really don't understand what they're talking about. Second, in another room, you can find lawyers talking about tort reform. Or in the case of how our financing models are being built up, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, most likely talking about what are the legal dimensions to public-private partnerships. In a totally different room, you can find urban planners talking about the future economies of the places where we all live. Now, there is one thing, though, that brings these people together, and that's actually just people, right? So when it comes to what we do on a daily basis, so much of our daily activities take place outside the home. From students studying in school to workers cramming in to their offices or the factory floors, to households shopping for their daily needs, to residents just finding time for a little bit of exercise. So many things that we do, again, take place outside the home. And so if we want to accomplish our personal daily goals, then we need to get moving. And to make all of this uncoordinated ballet possible, we need transportation networks that connect people to opportunity. Now, this requires a mix of transportation modes. It depends on the geography of place of where you live and where you're trying to go, the distances traveled, the time that you have available to do all of those daily activities. And we also need those systems to be equitable, right? We need those systems to work for all people and make sure they can all get where they need to go, irrespective of income or skin color. Yet while every year we see new roads and transit lines built, new housing structures take shape, we need to ask ourselves really important questions. Are we building communities that work for all people? I want you to take a second and think about your hometown, or for most of us, especially those of us who live in Washington, our adopted hometowns. When you think about all the neighborhoods where you live, do they all connect people to opportunity? Do they all move? Can people always move as easily in each of those places? Are we building those communities with the right purpose? And do our systems reflect the kind of broader objectives we want to achieve? Our Moving to Access initiative is an applied research project to attempt to answer those very questions. Along with my co-director, Jeff Gutman, a senior fellow in the Brookings Global Economy and Development Program, our absolutely tireless staff here at Brookings, and a truly impressive network of co-authors and advisors, this project represents our efforts to put people at the center of how we design, deliver, govern, and finance urban transportation. Now, doing so isn't going to be easy. And as we're going to discuss throughout the day, or at least this morning, there are significant path dependencies that stand in our way. Current investment models unintentionally favor the wealthy and outright favor the automobile in most cases. Too often, cities and regions get built without broader objectives in mind. And the various disciplines that all have a hand in how we plan and build our communities too often prefer to operate in silos rather than coordinate up, down, and across agency divisions. But the opportunities here couldn't be greater to tilt those paths. So today, I want to talk about our project and the concept of accessibility in 3 phases. First, we need to take the time to better understand exactly how we're physically building communities today. What does that look like on the ground? What's guiding those decisions? And what are some of the obvious blocks to our path forward? Second, the concept of accessibility offers a new way forward, but that path won't be easy, and there are many blocks in addition, just if we try to go along that path. And then finally, I'll conclude with what we all can do, not just this team and this initiative, to advance this theory into practice a bit more. But let's go back to where we stand today. So last time I actually spoke up here, which is a few months back, I made a confession. So I'm now going to make another confession. I don't know why I treat this a little bit like my religious house, speaking on the stage. But I'm a Floridian. And sometimes that's actually really embarrassing to say to people. You can make up all the tropes in your mind. If you don't follow Florida Man on Twitter, it's a really important part of the internet in a corner to learn about really funny stories. And I'm not just saying that. Really, you should follow Florida Man on Twitter. But actually, to be honest, when I think about why I'm a bit embarrassed to be a Floridian is I didn't really like the community that I grew up in. We always felt like we were stuck in cars. It took forever to get everywhere. And in many ways, that's because Florida is a symbol of what it's like to develop in an era where there's air conditioning, first of all, at least for us. But more importantly, the automobile was here, and we could build communities around it. I want you to make sure for the next few slides that you put your eyes a little bit on the upper right corner at first to see what we're talking about. And obviously, we're talking about Miami here, not my corner of Florida, but certainly our global symbol, and the year below it. And we'll often be starting in the 1980s. I think what you can find is that we've often developed our communities very fast in an outward manner. In the case of Miami, we've encroached upon our most valuable natural treasure, the Everglades. And you can see super blocks that only filled up with time. But here's the thing. We oftentimes, especially in the United States, think our development patterns are unique to us, but they're not. This is the desert palace known as Dubai. And you can see outward growth dramatically into the desert. New land taken up, new opportunities to move around, and of course, in the case of Dubai, new land created from scratch. Now, let's take this onto an actual supersized level. This is Bangkok, one of the world's truly great megacities. You can actually see Bangkok in the east start to eat up all of the land in its little corner of Thailand. Now, that's a dramatic change in development patterns from what was there before. And again, I want a case in point. This was already a megacity in 1984 effectively, and all it's doing is gobbling up more land. Now, it's not just the biggest cities of the world where names you already know. Whether it's Cairo to the forests of Alberta, we are constantly eating up land to put more people in more places for a whole range of reasons, from wanting more space to oftentimes wanting to stretch out distances between where we live. Now, I think what we really are seeing at play is the visualization of the current model we use to help people get around our cities. Too often, we are focused exclusively on moving vehicles quickly. We're too much focused, including inside our investment in engineering models, on solving congestion above everything else. And meanwhile, we've overlooked some of the unintended consequences from what this model means on the ground. So you saw it in play in 7 communities across the world, but again, you could put almost any of those stunning growth images on the screen and you would see similar development patterns. So most notably, for many of us that work in the urban economic and policy analysis fields, it's creating what we know as spatial mismatch. Now, that's kind of a fancy way of just saying something that you experience in your daily life, which it feels like, and it in fact is in place, that the distances between where people live and where they want to go are growing longer. So the question is, what have been our responses as households and how we choose to live our lives? Well, number one is people are addicted to cars. And in many ways, they're not to blame, right? How else could you get around? So you'll see on the left portion of the chart more developed economies, And you're seeing car ownership rates at the household level that are almost near ubiquity. But look further to the right for some of the countries you may not expect, where vehicle ownership rates are similarly high, including around 50% in many of the largest Latin American countries. Now, you may say this isn't surprising, but these are places with lower household per capita incomes that are choosing to dedicate most higher values than you might expect to vehicle ownership. But here's the thing. Personal motorized transportation comes in two forms. And in many of those same countries where you see lower car ownership rates, in fact, motorbike rates are increasingly high. So think back to that picture of Bangkok. So many of those residents are choosing to get around by motorbike. And while it may take up less engineering space on the road, it similarly requires fuel consumption and also exacerbates those kind of distances, unlocking, for at least an individual, more further distances that they can go, but only stretches our communities out further and further. Now, at the same time as all those vehicles are being owned, you can imagine that it ends up leading to higher household expenses. Now, it's really hard to find international comparisons on these numbers, but many folks are surprised to hear about just how much we're all spending just to get around. In many countries, you actually spend more on transportation than you do on food. Now, of course, vehicles are only contributing at the same time to a dirtier planet. By one measure, from 2014, the transportation sector now represents 23% of all carbon emissions. And while other sectors, like energy production and in industry and building stock, are getting more efficient, transportation is actually getting dirtier. And you can see that if by 2050, we don't solve our emissions problems that relate to all that driving and all those long distances, it will be impossible to mitigate the negative effects of climate change. Now, finally, here's the other issue, but also something that we can use as a pivot. We need to invest more in infrastructure. Based on a major McKinsey report, they estimate that on just transportation infrastructure alone, we need to invest globally $1.3 trillion in new infrastructure. Now, this includes new capacity. It also includes maintenance. And this raises a big question. Where is this investment going to happen? Well, I want to push you to look at the same chart that we've reproduced here from them. But if you put up a chart that similarly looked at population growth rates, it would look really similar. Because in fact, it's in the emerging parts of the world where population growth is fastest that we're going to need to make the biggest investments in transportation infrastructure. Now, folks can quibble with these numbers and exactly how big they should be, but here's what I want you to focus on for the rest of this conversation today. It's the question of, what are we going to build? Are we going to build the transportation and other related investments that led to those animated maps that you saw before? Or are we going to build something different, even recognizing the transformative industrial power we have along our transportation networks, but still get more efficient in how people choose to get around and what they can reach? So that leads to the second part of the conversation. How can we plan around accessibility? So let's be honest, though, and I really do appreciate all of you coming here, but how many of you knew what the term accessibility was before you walked in the room? That is so many more hands than I was expecting to see, and I was kind of hoping you wouldn't raise them. But for those of you who maybe are streaming, or those of you who just don't know, it's a term of art that's kind of difficult to fully understand, right? So first and foremost, in the transportation sector, we already use the word for something else, right? Now, what do we mean about access in this concept? So whether it's a regional highway network or a local sidewalk, the goal of our systems, as Martin said in the introduction, is to get people where we need to go. An accessibility approach to transportation captures this overarching pursuit. When academics and practitioners use the term accessibility, and this is the key kind of exact definition, they're referencing how many value destinations, whether it's jobs, schools, parks, shopping, individuals can reach in a given period of time. In a way, access reflects how each one of us thinks about travel on a daily basis. When you plan your commute to work, are you going to have time to stop by the dry cleaner? How about at the end of the day? Who's going to have time to pick up the kids? And based on that combination of time, and especially for those of us in our largest metropolitan areas across the world, it leads to the choices of what transportation modes we're going to take, right? Do we have to drive today because it feels like time's so tight, there's no options, and we feel confident we can find parking where we're going to go? Is time better and you want to get a quick walk-in, so you're going to take your local bus or rail network? That's what accessibility is really all about. Now, these decisions truly define our day, but they do more than just define our day. They actually define our more permanent choices too. Think about where you choose to live and all the mapping you did, or to determine the best neighborhood for you. And of course, probably your household budget as well. But then also think about when you're looking for a new job. Don't you look at where that zip code is of that employer? How long is it going to take to get to work? Access is part of how you think about life. And what truly separates accessibility from other applied theories in transportation is that its inherent multidisciplinarity. Accessibility requires a recognition of how different policy disciplines and their respective actors, inside and outside government, all have a role to play when it comes to connecting people to opportunity. So on the transportation side, access doesn't discriminate based on a particular transportation mode, nor does it look solely at isolated transportation corridors. Access also recognizes how much land use patterns affect how far people need to travel. And one of the most important aspects for Jeff and I as we move on this initiative is that it also needs to consider pricing. It can't just be transportation and land use, because both in terms of time taken and money spent, connecting people and places is not free. All these components interact in an urban mixing bowl that defines the places that we live, but also reflects long-term planning decisions. So I want to take a second and put this in a real-world example for a moment, not just the development maps we saw, but how access can actually change what we do. So this is Liverpool, England, and this is the site, or the original and continued site, as I'm giving away the story a little bit, of the Royal Liverpool Hospital. Now, Liverpool was considering moving their hospital. It's a conversation you've probably heard in so many different communities that you live in. So here was the site of the new hospital. Doesn't seem that far, although this scale is actually fairly large for a local urban area. Now, here's the catch. If we think about things in an accessibility way, so this is a heat map, by moving the new location, those who lived around the new hospital would be able to get there easier. The parts that you see in the red and yellow would have actually lost access to vital healthcare services. Now, not only can you see that that heat map that's yellow and red is bigger, here's the other way to note it. So many of those people who live in those yellow and red areas, they're transit-dependent populations. They were going to move the hospital further away from where the people who needed it most lived. Now, here's the other part of the issue. The proposed hospital was going to be cheaper to build, but the net costs on society were going to be higher. And because the United Kingdom at the time had accessibility practices on the books, you know what they did? They rebuilt the Royal Liverpool Hospital in the original location. It was better for the economy, even if it looked a little bit worse on their accounting books. Now, in the case of this Liverpool healthcare story, a better decision was made. But in most parts of the world, access isn't a formal part of the planning process. In fact, accessibility has long been a popular theory among academics, but we haven't seen it in practice. So this raises a major question. What stopped it from being adopted? So today, we are really excited to release a set of 4 papers that kind of get this conversation started for a more practitioner audience to define accessibility from 3 different perspectives in particular. Christo Venter, who's in town to join us for TRB today and conferences later in the week, authored a paper from the transportation perspective. Gilles Duranton and his co-author Eric Guerra, and you will hear from Gilles in the panel to follow this conversation, talked about it from an urban planning perspective. And third, Shahid Youssef talked about it from a fiscal and finance perspective. Jeff Gutman and I then synthesized these documents, and there's, I think, a pun intended here, the most accessible way we could, in a short 10-page document, for those of you who maybe didn't raise your hands, about what does access mean, and what are some of the common challenges that are blocking it if it's an idea that makes sense from moving into practice. And what these authors found, and what Jeff and I's own work and our teams found, is that there's 4 common themes that seem to separate and block accessibility theory from moving into practice. So number 1 is there's extreme lack of conceptual clarity here. Start with just the definition. It already has an alternative meaning within transportation, and even for those who know it, they can struggle with imagining what it looks like in practice. There's measurement issues. Christo talks about the wide range of different measurement types that you can use to put accessibility into practice, all of which are valid depending on the goals that you're trying to achieve. Similarly, it's expensive. You need new data, you need new software, and we'll have another paper just on that in the next 2 months coming out about how governments can move forward on putting accessibility data and software into play. Finally, there's no gold standard for what accessibility measures. How do we compare different neighborhoods? How do we compare different markets? And you might hear the panel after this talk about that a little bit from their different perspectives. Next, we have something known as legacy issues. And I highly recommend, if this part resonates with you, to check Gilles' paper. What we've built in the past is often permanent. It's near impossible to up and replace. For those of you who live in Washington, D.C., think about the expenses we're spending out in Tyson's Corner right now to try to remake a major neighborhood and regional job center. It also reflects, though, these past efforts, the economic ideals of the day. A downtown rail corridor looks a lot different than a suburban area. Even in the picture you're seeing on the right is Melbourne, Australia, known as the most livable city in the world. It's also the interaction between them that matters. Different areas of construction collide together on a daily basis in different ways. Third, who is going to pay for all this stuff? Too often in urban development planning, we overlook major questions about who would pay and who should pay. How can we share subsidies? How can we think about what services you pay for relative to the value that you get from the places either that you're living in or the property that you own? All of this needs to move in to a major bowl of decision making to come together to make better investments in the future. And of course, our governance frameworks are not necessarily evolved enough to advance an accessibility platform. Accessibility requires real coordination. We are so excited to have 3 different government officials here with us throughout this program today. You're going to hear about how tough coordination is. And yet, as it stands, agencies operate formally in silos. And oftentimes, even worse, they prefer it that way. How can we break through? So moving forward is obviously not going to be easy. But we're passionate about trying to advance that ball. And there's many efforts outside of Brookings that are, of course, already underway. Our colleagues at the University of Minnesota put out just some recent research last week, building on a real legacy of work both there, here at Brookings, and throughout the academic literature about measures to understand what does accessibility look like in your community. In the case of University of Minnesota, the 50 biggest markets in the United States. I highly recommend you check out that research online. Again, the same pun, it's very accessible. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are thinking about new ways to implement ideas about how we get around and who pays. And in the case of Bogota, but you could also say Lima, they're playing with new ideas around subsidies on how we can connect people to opportunity, in the case of Bogota, through their public transportation system. Now, our future work, we're pledging to do the following. Number 1 is we're going to keep advancing empirical work. There is so much more to understand about what are the actual economic benefits from accessibility. That research, which has been done in the past, needs to be communicated out to more people. We can advance thinking around measurement. We can test new ideas in cities and regions that are willing to experiment. We outline so much of this potential work in the overview document that we published today. But here's really the thought I want to leave you with, is that laundry list of work that needs to be done, it's much more than Jeff and I could ever get to on our own. So for those of you who are in the research community or work inside government, take a second to read that paper and look at the ideas for future work. There are so many opportunities to advance the literature here and to make sure that we better understand how to build communities for the future. We have a really exciting program for you for the rest of the day. Building on the messages from President Obama's speech last night, one that included an explicit focus on how we can help people reach better opportunity, U.S. Secretary of Transportation Anthony Foxx will be here to have a conversation with our VP, Amy Liu, about the work he's championed in office around this very topic. But before we get to Secretary Foxx and Amy, we have a panel that's going to explore more of the themes I've introduced today. I'll now turn the stage over to Kathy Sierra, a non-resident senior fellow here with the Brookings Institution and our moderator of the panel. We're all in extremely capable hands. So thank you, and Kathy, the stage is yours.